Having just celebrated the joy of Christmas yesterday as we welcome the gift of the Christ child who fills us with his light, with his love, and with his peace, the Church invites us to continue that joy in the midst of our Christmas season. And each Sunday after Christmas, we celebrate the feast of the Holy Family, this feast that looks at the inner life of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. And from the earliest days of the Church, she has proposed to us that the Holy Family is meant to be a model and a guide for us to live our lives as family members, and how it is that we are called to respond to God's will in our lives. But oftentimes, on first hearing this, we can want to throw up our hands and say, how is it possible that my family can be like the Holy Family? This seems to be something pie in the sky. For when we look at our own family, we say, my wife was not immaculately conceived, and she is not without sin. My husband isn't any saint. My child is not the son or daughter of God. How is it possible that we, in the midst of the ordinariness and the dailiness of our lives, can aim to be like the Holy Family? And so oftentimes we look upon the Holy Family with rosy-colored glasses, not being able to see the fullness of who they are, and simply holding on to small little snippets of how they lived their lives, and how they interacted with one another, and how they responded to God's will and invitation in their lives. In fact, when we look through the gospel stories, we see that there are very few passages, in fact, about the Holy Family. But as we look at some of these passages in the Gospel of St. Matthew and of St. Luke, we begin to get some glimpses of the Holy Family and how it is they lived their lives. And we recognize that the Holy Family, in the midst of their daily living, did not live picture-perfect lives. We think of how the young girl Mary, at probably 13 years old, engaged but not yet married, finds out that she is pregnant with child and does not know who the father is. We think of young Joseph as hearing the news that his bride-to-be is with child, not knowing who the father is. We think about the long journey that this young couple, well into their pregnancy, had to make from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the census. We think that when the time came for them to give birth, there was no room for them, and they found themselves in a stinky manger, there alone from family and friends, giving birth to their firstborn child. We think that after they had just given birth, they received these visitors from strangers, from shepherds, from magi, who are inquiring about who their son is. And then how in the middle of the night, at one point they need to flee to Egypt for fear that their son is going to be put to death. And still later, as we hear in our gospel this morning, how as they are in Jerusalem fulfilling their ritual obligations, they lose their child for 3 days. This does not sound like a picture-perfect family. They are a family very much like your family and my family, that have difficulties and troubles in the midst of it. But ultimately, what we realize when we take a look at the Holy Family, and as we look at our own families, that holiness is not a result of not having problems, but instead holiness is a result of welcoming the presence of God in our families. And this is what makes the Holy Family holy, and this is what can make our families holy. Not that we don't have problems, not that we don't have difficulties, not that we don't have struggles, but rather in the midst of those problems, in the midst of those struggles, in the midst of those difficulties, we welcome the presence of God so that He will guide us, He will strengthen us, He will support us, He will show us the way. And over again, as Mary and Joseph lived their lives raising their son Jesus, they relied on the presence of God to be able to assist them. And as such, they become models and guides for us some 2,000 years later of how it is that we are to foster our families and our relationships. How it is that we are to live in that same spirit of holiness, not because we don't have problems or difficulties, but because we welcome the presence of Emmanuel, God with us, in the midst of our lives, and try to be attentive to his voice and his calling, so that we can become more and more his people. And so this is what we celebrate today on the Feast of the Holy Family. This is why the Church continually presents to us the Holy Family as a model and a guide in the midst of our daily living. Ultimately, when we reflect upon this hidden inner life of Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, we see that there are three predominant characteristics that help them to be able to live that holiness in the midst of their daily lives. First and foremost, we see in the life of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus that they had a deep and abiding faith, that whenever God presented something to them, even though they didn't necessarily understand the circumstances and the situations, they responded with that great fiat, "Let it be done to me according to your word." And so whether it was when Mary heard the message from the angel, when the angel came to Joseph to make known what was happening, they continued to respond with that generous yes, because of their deep and abiding faith. We hear even of that deep and abiding faith in our gospel as they took the child Jesus to the temple as required by the law, so that they might be immersed in the worship and the praise of Yahweh God. It would have been Mary and Joseph that would have taught Jesus some of his first prayers, helping him to come to know the ancient scriptures of the past and making them alive and active in his heart and in his life, so that he would be ready and prepared to begin his public ministry later on in life. And so the first quality or characteristic that made the Holy Family holy was that they had a deep and abiding faith. They were always open and receptive to listening to the gentle and loving voice of God, and then putting that voice into action in the midst of their daily lives, trusting that he would guide them, support them, and sustain them. The second quality that we see lived out in the Holy Family is that they had a deep and abiding sense of love. They had a sense of love not only for themselves and those that were near to them, but they also had a deep love for God. And as such, they were able to live that great commandment, that great law of love, loving the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Mary and Joseph and Jesus were able to live that great commandment of love each and every day in their homes, in their relationships with one another, and as they responded to that gentle and loving invitation of God in their lives. And so they became more and more people of love, radiating the love of God to each other and to the world that they encountered. And finally, the third quality or characteristic that we see in Mary, Jesus, and Joseph that allowed them to be the holy family that they were is the fact that they were willing to spend time with one another, and that this time helped support them to be who they were called to be. We think of the long journey that they made from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We think of the journey they made from Bethlehem to Egypt, the time that they spent on pilgrimage going to the temple in Jerusalem in our gospel. They spent quality time with one another, allowing themselves to be immersed in conversation, in the presence of one another, being able to be there to support one another in the midst of their joys and their sorrows, in their blessings and their challenges. We can only imagine that as Jesus was growing up, how St. Joseph spent time with him, teaching him how to be a man, teaching him the skill of carpentry. And all of that happened because they spent time with one another. And through the spending of that time, they were able to develop in who they were called to be and to be able to make a difference in the lives of others. And so Mary, Jesus, and Joseph became holy not because they did not have problems, but because they allowed the presence of God in their hearts, in their lives, and in their homes. By growing in faith, by growing in love, by spending time with one another. And as this became the pathway for them to be able to advance in holiness and saintliness, so it becomes the pathway for us to advance in holiness and saintliness, individually and as members of the family of God. And so this is the great calling and invitation that we face, that each one of us belongs to our own families, families that are often not picture perfect, families that have difficulties and problems and struggles and brokenness. But in the midst of all of those realities that we faced, that Mary, that Joseph, that Jesus faced, are we willing and able to allow the presence of God to be in the midst of those situations, those circumstances, and allow him to guide us, to strengthen us, to direct us, so that we can not only be who we are called to be, but then in turn we can help our family be who we are called to be. Ultimately, the great vocation of each and every one of us is not only to be saints ourselves, but ultimately our vocation is to help others to be saints. Husbands, you are called to help your wives be saints. Wives, you are called to help your husbands become saints. Mothers and fathers, you are called to help make your children become saints. As children, we are called to help make our parents and our siblings saints. This is what it means to be a part of the family, to be a part of the family of God, but also to be a part of the family that God has entrusted to us. And so our great calling is to be saints in imitation of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. If we are going to do so, then we must embrace more and more those qualities and characteristics of deep and abiding faith, of loving God and our neighbor, and of being able to spend quality time with one another. And so as we continue to celebrate our Eucharist this morning, as we continue to celebrate the joy of this sacred season of Christmas, let us remind ourselves of how it is that we are called to grow in holiness and saintliness. Let us turn often to Mary, to Jesus, and to Joseph, to the Holy Family, as a model and guide of how it is that we are to live our family lives, especially when we are in the midst of difficult and trying times, and rely upon their intercession to aid and to guide us. And so let us be more and more like Mary, Jesus, and Joseph. Let us allow ourselves to continue to hear God's will in our lives, and then, like them, to respond, "Let it be done to me according to your word."